Good morning, and welcome to campus. My name is Brian Schmisek, and I'd like to welcome you to the University of St. Mary the Lake. We have a few minutes if you want to help yourself to something to drink. We want to welcome you. I'm the provost here, and it's my great honor and privilege to introduce to you our speaker today. Not only do we have our speaker here with us, but we have two outstanding faculty respondents as part of the 2024 Cardinal Meyer Lecture. Some of you might have been with us yesterday evening, where we had the privilege of hearing our speaker at downtown Chicago at the Union League Club. And that was part of our desire and mission to expand what we're doing into the city and reach various and different audiences. And this morning, it's just as important that we have and welcome you to campus. And you can see the beautiful setting, even though it's a cloudy, wintry day. It's not like it was last year when we had snow on the ground. So, a couple of years ago, Father Carci and I were talking about the Cardinal Meyer Lecture and who we might have for 2024. And I said, I think we might be able to have John Allen speak here. And he said, do you think we could get him for that? And I said, yeah, I think we could. And then we had a situation where the 2023 speaker didn't work out. We asked John to come in 2023, and unfortunately, he had a episode with cancer, and so we couldn't bring him in 2023. And I said to John, all of our prayers and support are with you. We really want to see you again. Let's aim for 2024, God willing, and God willed it, I guess. And so now we have him here with us. I first met John Allen more than 20 years ago. I'd been reading his columns and his writings for quite a while by then. I was leading some groups in Rome, adult graduate ministry students over the summers in Rome. And I thought, John Allen is in Rome, and I bet our students would love to hear from him. And so I reached out, found his email, and we met for lunch near St. Peter's. And that began a relationship where almost every summer he would come out to our Rome campus near the Via Appia and speak to our graduate ministry students. Usually after that, we would retire to a little piazza and drink wine and have some cheese and olives and just continue the conversation. And it was a lot of fun. And then we would invite him to events at the University of Dallas, where I was. So to make a long story short, I've known and followed John for a very long time and have been an admirer of his works. One of the things that you'll know about him, of course, is that he's a journalist, a Vatican expert, having lived in Rome essentially for the past 30 years. And one of the things that I appreciate is that not only does he have tremendous insight into the goings-on at the Vatican and the main players there, but he can convey it in a popular, accessible way. And I think sometimes we in academia do not share that same gift. So it's very admirable when we can see it in someone else. The other thing is that just a couple weeks ago, Mr. Allen was at the RE Congress, the Religious Education Congress. And sometimes that's in Anaheim, California. And people will say that that's the largest annual gathering of Catholics outside of a Notre Dame football game. And John will fill the crowd, and he speaks in the arena of the Anaheim Convention Center. And so I told him that we'll have a smaller crowd today than the arena of a convention center, but the quality will be outstanding. And so we're so happy to welcome you all here and to hear John Allen give us his presentation on the politics, posterity, and Pope
protocol,
and
right.
protocol of Pope Benedict XVI. So welcome, John.
Yeah. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, good people. Do you know that's a very Franciscan greeting? St. Francis, when he would walk the streets of the hill towns in Umbria, would always greet people saying, Buongiorno, brava gente. Means good morning, good people. So you've been greeted in the appropriately Franciscan fashion. here this morning. Brian, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me. I do want to apologize that I was not able to be with you last year. I was very much looking forward to that. But as Brian said, it wasn't quite in God's plan. But here we are now. And in some ways, it is all the more sweet for having had to wait a year to be here, because there was a time after my surgery I wasn't really sure I was going to be able to get back on the lecture circuit, and the fact that I have been able to do that has taught me to appreciate and savor these moments, because it's not guaranteed that they're always going to be here. And so the opportunity to be with you all is all the more meaningful for that reason. I do want to start, obviously we're going to be talking about Pope Benedict today, but before I get into that, I do have one thing that I would like to say to all of you. And it's a very simple message. And it is this. I am profoundly conscious that on my best days, I do no more than describe the life of the Catholic Church. That is, I watch and I listen and I talk to people and I try to synthesize what I've been able to pick up, and that's, I suppose there is value to that, but it is a derivative and second-order exercise. Meanwhile, I am deeply aware that it is all of you who actually make the Catholic Church in this country come alive. That is, in your various ways. Some of you here are educators, some of you are administrators, some of you are in training for the priesthood, some of you are involved in various ministries. But you are where the rubber meets the road in terms of the life of the church. In other words, if I were to disappear, there would be somewhat less description. If you were to disappear, there would be no church left to describe. And so if you hear nothing else from me today, I want you to hear this. From the bottom of my heart, a very simple two-word message. And those two words are thank you. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. You make this church the precious reality it is. Without you, there would be no Catholic life, and I will never be finished telling you how grateful I am for everything that you do. So thank you. And by the way, those of you who do a lot of public speaking, I really recommend this to you as a rhetorical strategy. Always start by flattering your audience. If you do that, you can usually get away with murder. And let's test that theory, shall we? By moving on to the meat of today's presentation. Now, as Brian indicated, I've been asked to talk to you about the legacy of Pope Benedict XVI. And on the subject of rhetorical strategies, this probably isn't the greatest one you're ever going to encounter. That is, it's probably not a smart idea for a speaker to eviscerate his own credibility at the beginning of a presentation. But, you know, I mean, why not? It's Lent, confession is good for the soul, so let me deliver a confession to you, which is that on the subject of Pope Benedict XVI, my track record as a commentator and prognosticator is not exactly what you would call unblemished. The most spectacular example of my failure in this regard came in 1999, when I published a biography of then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the final chapter of which contained 4 reasons why he would never be Pope. This is a point the Holy Father reminded me of quite often over the course of his 8-year papacy. Towards the end, he actually pulled me aside once and said, you know, there are days I wish you'd been right. But I say all this because I want you to understand that I cannot claim to be a dispassionate observer when it comes to Pope Benedict XVI. I've had the privilege during the course of my career to cover 3 popes. Those popes, of course, John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis. Of the 3, by far, my closest personal relationship, my closest bond, was with Pope Benedict XVI. John Paul was already Pope when I got to Rome. You know, I mean, it is frightening for me to admit this to you, but do you realize that when he was elected in 1978, I was in middle school? I mean, this is winding the clock back a bit. And so when I got to Rome in the mid-90s, of course, he had been there for almost 20 years. And although I met him on you know, numerous occasions and so on, you know, when you are Pope, you move in something of a bubble. Access is a bit restricted. And so I didn't really have the opportunity to develop what I would describe as a close, personal, intimate relationship. Meanwhile, with Pope Francis, of course, he didn't live in Rome prior to his election. As the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he would come to Rome once a year. He limited it to one trip a year, and he described it as his penitential pilgrimage to Rome. He wasn't much of a traveler back in those days. And so while I met him on a few occasions during those years, again, it was sort of at a distance. By the way, if you're interested, when we get to Q&A, ask me to tell you the story of my first meeting with then Cardinal Bergoglio. It was in 2001, and it's a whopper. But I'll spare you that now. So in any event, Ratzinger, on the other hand, was, from 1983 to 2005, his election as Pope, he was basically a Roman. You know, he was the prefect of the Holy Office. And so I interviewed him on dozens of occasions, and I would run into him at receptions and dinners in various Roman events, and had the opportunity to develop a truly close personal relationship with the man, which means that I feel a sort of affinity for him. And bundled with that affinity, I have also always felt quite protective of Benedict XVI, because here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. As a media professional, I would submit to you that I don't think there was a single public figure in the last 50 years, and I don't just mean Catholic public, I mean any public figure in the last 50 years, where the disjunction between the private personality and the public narrative was as glaring and contradictory as it was with Benedict XVI. Trust me on this, on a personal level, when it comes to Benedict XVI, you will never have met a nicer guy. He was the kindest, gentlest, warmest, least foreboding, just the most wonderful person that you would ever meet, with a genuine humility about him and a kind of interest in the person who was standing in front of him that was just infectious and real and mesmerizing. That, however, as you know, was not the public narrative about Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, right? We all know what the public narrative was, right? That Ratzinger was this, well, he was Herr Panzer Cardinal, right? He was the German shepherd. He was Darth Vader in a cassock, right? When he walked into rooms, you could almost hear the imperial death march going off in people's heads, right? Dun, dun, da, da, right? I mean, any number of examples of that narrative I could give you, but here's my personal favorite. Ratzinger, of course, is elected in April 2005. The day after his election, there was an editorial cartoon in the Italian newspaper L'Unità, which is the newspaper of the old Italian Communist Party. You know, Italians never got the memo that communism is actually dead. So, you know, there continues to be a communist party that continues having meetings and fielding candidates and publishing newspapers for all the world as if it's still a going concern. And in any event, so you have this somewhat, well, fairly leftist, anti-clerical newspaper that had this editorial cartoon. Now, the editorial cartoon played off an Italian memory that is like deeply embedded in Italian national consciousness. This memory dates to October 1962. It was the opening night of the Second Vatican Council. And on this evening, the Catholic Action, which is the largest lay movement in Italy, had organized a torch-lit parade that began at the Castel San Angelo, processed down the Via della Conciliazione, that's that broad avenue leading up to St. Peter's Square, and then ended up in this square. And it was literally 1,000 points of light, because all of these people were, of course, holding torches. Pope John the 23rd, good Pope John, right, the Pope of the Council, comes to the window of the papal apartments, and this was not scripted. There was no plan for this. The Pope was just supposed to give a little blessing, but you know, he went on one of these stream of consciousness jags for which he was famous. And so he started talking about, oh, you know, look at the moon, what a beautiful moon we have tonight. Even the moon has come out to see this show because it is so beautiful. It's, and the Italians call it the discorso alla luna, the speech to the moon, okay? And the most famous line from this speech is a line that is burned into the memory of every Italian. They teach this in schools, okay? By the time kids reach the age of reason, they can recite this from memory, okay? It's like 7 years ago for us, okay? It's that kind of thing. And the line was this. I'll give it to you in Italian and then I'll translate. In Italian, it goes like this. Stasera, tornando a casa, troverete I vostri bambini. Date ai vostri bambini una carezza, e dite che è la carezza del Papa. Which means, tonight, when you go home, you're going to find your kids. Give your kids a kiss and tell them that it's the kiss of the Pope. It's just a beautiful pastoral moment, right? All right, so flash forward to 2005. Benedict XVI, with this awful Darth Vader-esque narrative, okay, has been elected Pope. The editorial cartoon shows the new Pope, Pope Ratzinger, standing at the window, once again, looking over a crowd at nighttime in St. Peter's Square. And the caption is, tonight when you go home, give your kids a spanking and tell them that this is the spanking of the Pope. And that captured it, right? That captured what people thought. And it was a tremendous injustice and remains a tremendous injustice because it is just so diametrically opposed to the actual reality of the man that we're talking about. And in addition, I feel protective of him not only because he had the misfortune of coming into office with this narrative. And remember, when John Paul II was elected, he had no narrative. No one had ever heard of Archbishop Karol Wojtyła of Krakow. He had the opportunity to create his own narrative. He did it brilliantly. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina was elected, he had no global narrative. Again, he had the opportunity to do it himself, and again, he did it brilliantly. Pope Benedict did not have that opportunity. Okay, he carried baggage with him into office. In addition, throughout the course of his papacy, the poor guy so often just could not catch a break. I mean, repeatedly, there were moments when he succeeded in putting a dent in that negative narrative, and then something would erupt and go wrong and go haywire, and we would be back where we started. So, for instance, in 2005, the new Pope, Pope Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, puts out an encyclical letter on, well, human sexuality, really, called Deus Caritas Est, God is love, okay? And in the abstract, you know, if someone were to have asked you in 2005 if Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, is going to put out an encyclical letter on human eroticism, what approach do you think it is going to take? And I think most people would have assumed that it would be a catalog, would be an exercise in finger waving, right? Don't do this, don't do that, you know, stop being bad boys and girls. But in fact, of course, Deus Caritas Est was this remarkable, almost lyrical, poetic treatment of human erotic love as an icon of the love among the persons of the Trinity, okay? Even Hans Küng, of all people, praised it as the best papal document ever written on human sexuality. So we have this moment in which it seems as if the Pope is about to change perceptions, and then what happens? We get the Dino Boffo affair. Now, I realize probably most of you didn't follow this because it was an intrinsically Italian story, but Dino Boffo was the editor of the official newspaper of the Italian Bishops' Conference. The newspaper's called L'Avvenire, it means the future. And in early 2006, a story broke first that Boffo had been involved in harassing, basically in harassing someone that he wanted to be his gay partner, and that he had been investigated by the police for this sort of verbal harassment. It then emerged that the alleged police document making these charges against him was actually a fake. Somebody had cooked it up on Photoshop and put it into circulation. The question then became, okay, well, who was behind that? Okay, who did that? And here's the thing about Italians, ladies and gentlemen. As Brian said, I've lived in Italy virtually my entire adult life. I mean, as we say in Italian, sono quasi italianizzato. I'm basically Italianized, okay? But I can tell you this, okay, as an adoptive son of Italy that loves his adopted country. God love the Italians. They have never seen a conspiracy theory they are not prepared to believe. Okay? So the conspiracy theory in this case was that ultimately this smear job on Dino Boffo had been ordered by Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, who was the Vatican Secretary of State, who put up the editor of the Vatican newspaper, Gian-Maria Vian, to concocting this fake document, and then used the head of the Vatican gendarmes, an Italian layman by the name of Domenico Gianni, to put it into circulation. This theory metastasized for 18 full days before the Vatican said word one about it. So by the time they actually got around to saying it ain't so, popular Italian sentiment was captured by a headline in the newspaper Il Messaggero, which read, Il Vaticano nego tutto, nessuno ci crede, which means the Vatican denies everything, no one believes it. Okay, my point is that horrible communications mismanagement of this story blotted the positive narrative that was beginning to take shape about the Pope out of the sky. Or we could talk about Pope Benedict's wildly successful trip to the United States in 2008. Many of you, I'm sure, remember this. Among other things, it was the very first time a pope ever met with victims of clerical sexual abuse, which he did in the nunciature in D.C. I interviewed the victims after that meeting who, to a person, were talking about how heartsick the Pope obviously was and what a wonderful pastoral moment it was that he listened to their stories and shared their suffering. Again, what happens immediately afterwards? Just a couple of months later, we get the Bishop Williamson affair. This is the case of the Holocaust-denying traditionalist bishop who was kind of inadvertently rehabilitated by Pope Benedict XVI. The Pope wanted to lift the excommunications of the 4 traditionalist bishops who had been consecrated by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre in an effort to end the Lefebvrite schism. As Pope Benedict later acknowledged, however, he had failed to Google the names of these guys and figure out what their backgrounds were, so it looked for all the world as if the Pope was giving a free pass to a guy who had a public track record as a Holocaust denier. We can flash forward again. In 2010, the Pope makes a phenomenally successful visit to the United Kingdom. We'll actually talk about that in a moment. And shortly after that, we get the VatiLeaks affair. Y'all remember this? This is the story of the theft and the publication of confidential documents from Pope Benedict XVI. Folks, teams of Hollywood screenwriters could not dream this stuff up because, believe it or not, the butler actually did it. It was the Pope's butler, Paolo Gabriele, who stole these documents off his desk, leaked them to Italian journalists, creating endless amounts of embarrassment, and basically creating the impression that this was the gang that couldn't shoot straight, okay? My point is that repeatedly throughout his papacy, these magnificent contributions and accomplishments of Pope Benedict sort of got blotted out of the sky by just a series of administrative and managerial calamities. And look, I don't mean to excuse Benedict for responsibility for that to some extent. I mean, ultimately, the buck stops in his desk. He did put people in positions of power who ultimately simply could not make the trains run on time, and that is ultimately his responsibility. But I also want to say this, and this is the heart of the case I want to make to you today, that in the long run of history, the names I just ticked off, Dino Boffo, Richard Williamson, Paolo Gabriele, no one will remember these people. These episodes will fade from view. And in the meantime, the permanent and lasting contributions of the Benedict papacy will endure. So let's talk about what are those contributions. And I want to try to do this at 2 levels. I'm going to talk first about the popular legacy of Benedict XVI. That is, what will the wider world remember about Pope Benedict? What will it take away over the arc of time? And then we will increase the level of magnification and talk about what will the church remember about Benedict and specialists. The kinds of people who take seminars at this university, okay? What will they remember? Let's start at the popular level. I have this theory that at the popular level, you can sum up every modern pope's legacy in basically 2 words, okay? That is what most average people would remember about these guys. Now, by modern pope, I'm defining this as beginning with Leo XIII in his election in 1878, because that was the first pope elected after the collapse of the papal states, and so the end of the old regime, the beginning of the new modern papacy. Not counting Francis, because of course his papacy remains a work in progress, there have been 10 popes over that span of time, from 1878 to 2013. And I'm going to suggest that you can give a quick and dirty 2-word summary in terms of what we now remember about these popes. And by the way, let me concede in advance that those of you who are specialized students of papal history will get a case of agita, of heartburn from me doing this, because let me be clear, the average length of these papacies over this span of time was 14.5 years. Okay, that's 3.5 presidential terms. Okay, these popes did lots of stuff. Okay, they issued encyclicals, they issued motu proprio, they made personnel appointments, they engaged political questions. Modern popes took trips, and so forth and so on. So to try to boil all this down to a 2-word soundbite is in some ways horribly unfair and inevitably, a disservice to the historical record. That said, I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, so here we go. Leo XIII. I would give you the 2 words social teaching. I think what we remember is that Pope Leo was the father of modern Catholic social theory with his encyclical Rerum Novarum. Pius X, who followed Leo, anti-modernism. And yes, okay, I know that's 1 word, all right, but it contains 2 ideas, right? Modernism and being against it, okay? And so what we remember about Pius X was the loyalty oaths and the crackdowns and the sodalities that were basically surveillance committees to figure out who was modernists in parishes and things like that. Benedict XV, useless slaughter. That was the famous phrase he coined to describe the First World War. And what we remember about Benedict, I think, was his, in the moment, failed efforts to end the First World War, but the fact that those efforts set the stage for the creation of the League of Nations and ultimately the United Nations. Pius XI, Lateran Pax. It was Pius XI who signed the deal with Mussolini that ended the old Roman question. Basically, the Vatican made its peace with the new secular democratic Roman Republic, and it made its peace with secular democracy generally as a result of that agreement. Pius XII, Holocaust silence. I think that's what we remember. Silence in quotes, obviously. What we remember is the debate about whether Pius XII did or did not do enough to engage the Holocaust during the Second World War. Now we come into popes who are within the living memory of at least some of us, and I think this gets even easier. John the 23rd, Vatican II, those are the 2 words, right? That's what we remember, that he was the pope who summoned the Second Vatican Council. Paul VI, again, no-brainer, Humanae Vitae. Right? His famous 1968 encyclical reaffirming the Church's traditional ban on birth control. John Paul I, only around 33 days, but again, I think it's a slam dunk. Smiling Pope, right? That's what we remember, that after the sort of gloom and doom of the late Paul VI period, here you had this charming, captivating, engaging new personality who sort of set the world on fire, right? John Paul II, this is much more difficult because this is a papacy of almost 27 years and an incredibly rich and complicated legacy, but 2 words I will give you, ending communism. I think in the long arc of time, that's what people will remember about John Paul II, that he was the pope who set the dominoes in motion with his sponsorship of the Solidarity movement in Poland that eventually led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Empire, okay? And now we come to Benedict XVI, and I think this is the easiest one of all. Okay? I think it's the biggest no-brainer, the biggest slam dunk of all. 100 years from now, 200 years from now, what will people remember at the popular level about Benedict XVI? 2 words, he quit. That's what people will remember. The fact that he was the first pope in 500 years to resign the papacy, and really the first ever who did it under uncontested circumstances. Okay? I believe that Benedict's resignation was probably certainly in our lifetimes, and arguably almost of all times, it was the most eloquent, towering, emphatic rejection of clericalism in the long history of Roman Catholicism. If we define clericalism as the lust for clerical power and privilege, this kind of preening need to lord it over others, the pathology of clericalism. Think about it. This was a man who had arrived at the absolute apex of the clerical food chain, who was invested with absolute power. Code of Canon Law, Canon 331, the Pope is invested with full, supreme, universal, and ordinary jurisdiction, functionally meaning he can do whatever the hell he wants. Okay? You're invested with that kind of power, and you voluntarily set it aside because you believe you no longer have the capacity to exercise it in the common good of the ecclesial community. We have never seen anything like that. And I think that self-effacing, generous, humble act has not only reshaped Benedict's narrative, but it has shaped the legacy that in the popular mind will endure for all time. Let me put this to you differently. I would suggest that Benedict XVI is the Catholic Cincinnatus. Right? You all know the story of Cincinnatus, right? This ancient Roman figure who was a patrician. He had retired and gone back to his farm. A crisis arose. There was a foreign invasion. The people clamored for Cincinnatus to return and to take power. They made him the dictator. He was the first man in history for whom the dictator was an actual title of an office. Okay, invested him with absolute authority. Cincinnatus accepted the authority. He aroused an army. He defeated the foreign invaders. The crisis was ended, and he promptly renounced those absolute powers that he had been given and returned to his farm because he felt that he had performed the service the people had called him to perform, and that holding on to power beyond that moment would not serve the public interest. To this day, centuries later, the example of Cincinnatus towers as a kind of moral riposte to any public figure who tries to cling to power past their sell-by date. To this day, in schools, children are taught the example of Cincinnatus as a kind of model of civic virtue. And I would contend that in the Catholic realm, Benedict XVI will have the same role in the collective Catholic imagination going forward. Whenever we see a figure in the church who appears to want to wrap their hands around power, not for the public good, but for their own personal interest, the eternal response will be like Benedict. Make the choice that Benedict made. In other words, it is a constant corrective to the temptation and the lust of power. And that, ladies and gentlemen, at the popular level, I would submit to you, is the legacy that Benedict has bequeathed and that will endure. Now, let us move from the popular level into the sort of ecclesiastical realm and the level of specialists. By the way, let me, spoiler alert, I'm getting way out of my depth here, but you've got two actual experts who are going to be following me later who can clean up whatever I get wrong. But let me take a stab at it, nevertheless. And I'm going to make a distinction here. I want to talk about Benedict XVI's legacy as Pope. Because here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, had Joseph Ratzinger never been elected Pope, for that matter, had he never been made a bishop or a cardinal, we would still be gathering in venues such as this to discuss his theological legacy. We would remember Joseph Ratzinger in the company of Karl Rahner and Hans Urs von Balthasar and Dominic Chenu and Yves Congar and Edward Schillebeeckx and the other great theological titans that shaped the era of the Second Vatican Council and its aftermath. So there is that legacy. Ratzinger's writings on eschatology, on liturgy, Scripture, they are permanent contributions to the Catholic intellectual tradition. And then, of course, there is his track record of more than 20 years as the doctrinal prefect, the leader of the Holy Office, what the Italians once upon a time called La Suprema, the supreme congregation in the Vatican, the role once held by St. Robert Bellarmine. Okay? And the teaching documents that were produced under his stewardship during those years. I mean, one can think, for example, of that great 2000 document, Dominus Jesus, about the relationship between Christianity and the other great religious traditions of the world. certainly was and remains a controversial document, but it is certainly an inevitable point of reference in any conversation you want to have on that subject, okay? So had he never been Pope, all of that would still be there. But I want to narrow the focus a little bit to his magisterium as Pope and what his posterity in that sense will be. And here I'm going to give you another two words. I gave you he quit as the popular takeaway. As the kind of insider down in the weeds takeaway, I want to give you reason and faith. Reason and faith, because I think the magisterium of Benedict's papacy can be understood as one sustained 8-year-long graduate level seminar on the relationship between reason and faith. In effect, the argument that Pope Benedict wanted to present to the world was that reason and faith need one another, that they are codependent, that to be healthy, they have to be symbiotic. Basically, his argument was that reason shorn of faith becomes skepticism and nihilism. It becomes nothing other than kind of the blind drive for power, unshorn of any moral compass. Meanwhile, his argument was that faith shorn of reason becomes fundamentalism and extremism. It becomes misdirected, irrational, violent passion. So that for faith and reason to be healthy, they have to be in a vibrant relationship. And let me be clear that this wasn't just some sort of idiosyncratic personal preoccupation of an egg-headed pope, because everything in Joseph Ratzinger's life had shaped him to see this as the defining, towering question of the times. We're talking about a man who was born in 1927. So he was 6 years old when Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933. He was 18 when the Thousand-Year Reich ended in 1945. He spent the last few months of that war as an American prisoner of war. And then, of course, later in his early priestly career, he saw the rise of the Soviet system. He experienced the 1968 student revolutions at Tübingen. He had family who lived in East Germany. He knew from the inside the reality of the Soviet-dominated system, of the Soviet bloc. And in both cases, he drew the conclusion that both with National Socialism and with Soviet communism, you saw the pathology, the distortions in human experience which happen when you separate reason from faith, or when you separate the stewardship of human experience from any sense of ultimate moral truth. Because if you take truth off of the table, you take truth out of the equation, all you were left with is power, the drive for power. And he felt he had witnessed the titanic and cataclysmically destructive consequences of that pathology in his own life. Let me point out, for example, that Joseph Ratzinger had a cousin who was executed, who had a cousin with Down syndrome, who was executed by the Nazis in 1941 as part of their eugenics program. And he saw in that a denial of the objective moral truth, of the inherent dignity of each and every human life. And he saw what a system built on that lie looked like, in flesh and blood and bone. And so the passion he brought to this subject was not only intellectual, but it was deeply personal. And I want to suggest that over the course of his papacy, there were 4 touchstone documents in which this graduate seminar about reason and faith were most fully elaborated. Those documents, they're all speeches he gave on his trips. The first was his address at Regensburg, the University of Regensburg in Bavaria in 2006. The second was a speech he gave at the Collège des Bernardines in Paris in 2008. The third was an address he gave at Westminster Hall in the UK in 2010. Fourth and finally, a speech he gave to the Bundestag in Germany in 2011. And before we talk about the substance of those addresses, just first of all, note the venues. None of these are ecclesiastical spaces. These are secular venues. Okay? The University of Regensburg is part of the public university system in Germany. It's one of the places Ratzinger had taught at as a young professor. The Collège des Bernardines, even though it was founded by the Cistercians, is now part of the University of Paris system. Westminster Hall, of course, is the cradle of the British Parliament, and the Bundestag is the center of German democracy. And he deliberately chose these secular venues because he wanted to have a conversation between religious faith and postmodern secularism, between the apostles of reason and the apostles of faith. In Regensburg, of course, what most people remember at the time about the Regensburg Address is that one line, which sort of got shot out of a cannon and made the rounds of the world, where he quoted a Byzantine emperor with regard to the prophet Muhammad, saying that Muhammad brought things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached. That line, ripped out of context, created a kind of firestorm of protest and controversy. It seemed for a time as if the new pope was trying to press the clash of civilizations or whatever. But if you actually read the Regensburg Address, he was not critiquing Islam. He was critiquing certain trends in modern Christian theology, and specifically what he saw as the effort to de-Hellenize Christianity, that is, to sort of identify a pure gospel that could be detached from its relationship with Greek philosophy and later Roman intellectual currents, to which Pope Benedict said no, that the encounter between the Christian proclamation and the Greek philosophical system was providential. It was an aspect of salvation history, because what Greek philosophy gave the early Christian proclamation was this fundamental bedrock conviction about the rationality of faith, that faith must be rational because the divine author of the universe is the author of rationality. And so that this relationship, this sort of genetic relationship between reason and faith, is at the very heart of the Christian experience. Then at the Collège des Bernardines, his focus was on positivism. And this positivistic notion that only what can be established by the empirical sciences counts as truth. His argument there is that it's an abdication of reason. It is a fatal truncation of our notion of truth, because if we accept the gospel of positivism, then we are ruling out the notion that there is any objective moral order to the universe. And again, his life experience would suggest we know where that leads. Okay? In Westminster Hall, it was about the relationship between religion and democracy. And basically his argument there was that for secular democracy to be healthy, it requires the sort of infusion of values, of ethical convictions and ethical wisdom that the great religious traditions of humanity can provide. And his example was the abolition of the slave trade in the 19th century. He pointed out, of course, that the British played a lead role in the abolition of the slave trade, and he posed the question, where did the conviction of the evil of slavery come from? It was not supplied by secular democracy, because in democracy, you can justify the domination of a majority against a minority, right? So where did the notion that was an abuse of the power that a majority can create for itself, where did that notion come from? And of course, historically, he was absolutely right about this, it came from the passionate religious convictions of the abolitionists. His point was that secular democracy and religious faith need to be in vital dialogue. That secular democracy can supply the sort of inclusion and participation and sense of investment in the social order that a healthy society needs, but in order for its moral compass to be pointed to true north, it needs the ethical wisdom that religious traditions can supply. And then finally, in his address at the Bundestag in 2011, his focus there was on natural law and the importance of recovering the natural law tradition. Interesting footnote to that, today it is quite popular to think about Pope Francis as like the eco-pope, right? The environmentalist pope. And that's fair enough. I mean, the first pope to publish an encyclical on the environment in Laudato Si', his advocacy around climate change and all of that. But let us not forget that the first green pope in history wasn't Francis, it was actually Benedict. It was Benedict who installed solar panels atop the Aula Nervi, the Paul VI audience hall in the Vatican. It was Benedict who signed an agreement to reforest a stretch of central Hungary that made the Vatican Europe's first carbon-neutral state. And why did he do all of that? It wasn't simply because he was convinced of the science behind climate change, although he certainly was. But he also saw contemporary environmentalism as a route for recovering the natural law tradition. His reasoning was that people in the 21st century are coming to see that there is an owner's manual, so to speak, in the universe. We can't simply do whatever we want to nature without paying a price. That there are rules and limits that come embedded in the natural order. And he felt if we can recover that notion with regard to climate change and the environment, perhaps we can recover it in other areas of life as well. And he unfolded that argument in this address to the Bundestag. You put these four great documents together, ladies and gentlemen, what you have is a permanent gift to any serious reflection about the relationship between faith and reason, religion and secularity. I think it will be impossible for future generations in venues such as this, that is academic settings, universities and so on. No one could possibly teach a course on this subject without taking note of the contributions that Benedict made to the conversation. But more deeply than that, I think what Benedict has given us all is the scaffolding upon which a serious engagement with secular culture can be erected. In other words, he has given us as believers the tools we need to make the case that religious faith is not the renunciation of reason, it is in fact the apotheosis of reason. There is a confidence in that, a serenity about the ultimate rationality of who we are and what we are about. That is a precious and irreplaceable gift, and I think will shine forever as long as these questions are asked, as long as people take seriously the question of how to be a serious religious believer in a pluralistic and diverse cultural milieu. And I see no evidence, ladies and gentlemen, the tides of history are pushing us back towards Christendom, which suggests to me that these questions are going to be with us for some time, and so will the tools for engaging those questions in a constructive, positive, and rational fashion that Pope Benedict has given us. Look, I want to acknowledge that there are controversial aspects of Benedict's papacy, and there is a healthy conversation that can be made about many particular choices that happened along the way. I mean, his retirement, for example, you probably know there are aspects of that that have been the subject of controversy. Some people believe it was inappropriate for him to continue to refer to himself as the Pope, that he should have gone back to just being Cardinal Ratzinger. Some believe it was inappropriate for him to continue to wear white or to continue to live in the Vatican, the Mater Ecclesiae monastery, rather than going back to Regensburg. In terms of his teaching magisterium, there are people who will argue that it was excessively Eurocentric and that he failed to engage some of the titanic global shifts in Catholicism that are underway and in some ways are reaching full flower in the Pope Francis era, and on and on. And it is perfectly fair and legitimate to have those conversations. But at the end of the day, I think it is important that we not lose sight of the forest for the trees. And the forest, when it comes to Pope Benedict, is that during the course of his papacy, he gave us a teaching magisterium of unsurpassed quality on one of the central, defining, galvanizing questions of our times. And in the way his papacy ended, he gave us an example of selflessness and humility that will echo through the ages. And no legitimate debate about particular aspects of the man or his papacy should obscure from our vision those two shining truths that I would submit to you will form forever the posterity of this remarkable and singular Pope. Thank you.
So thank you, John. You've given us a lot to think about, and we're going to be looking forward to our faculty respondents, but I think it would be good for us now to take a 15-minute break You can refresh your drinks, use the restrooms, and we'll come back here at, let's say, maybe a 17-minute break. We'll come back at 10 minutes after 10.